People that found the conspiracies earlier said they're normally traumatized. You went through pedophilia. When your primal authority figures aren't trustworthy and you get older, you can just see, oh, this is bullshit.
What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Dylan Roth, and today I have something a little bit different for you. If you watch my channel, you probably know that a lot of my content goes against the official narrative. I am here to shine a light on why this phenomenon is so relevant now. What are we as a collective trying to integrate with these theories? What does it reflect about our psyches, and what does it say about our relationship with authority? The events of 9/11 produced in the entire world a massive seizure of psychological trauma. The deceivers and evil, destructive psychopaths who planned and executed that event, not only did they commit an act of destruction on that day, which took the lives of people and destroyed buildings, but even more so, they perpetrated an act of mental warfare. Psychological warfare of the most massive scope. And it had tremendous impact. The whole of humanity was pushed into a state of fear and confusion. And to quell all of that fear and confusion, what happened on 9/11 and who was responsible for it could only be explained at the time by the authority figures that we put our trust into. The internet was in its early stages. There was very little access to alternate news, so we listened to what the government and people on television told us. But after 9/11 and the endless wars that followed, we learned that these same people weren't telling the truth about other things. We were told that America needed to invade Iraq because there were supposedly weapons of mass destruction, and it turns out there were none. So if they were lying about one thing, naturally people are going to ask, what else were they lying about? Did we need something like the Patriot Act, which created an overbearing surveillance state? Did we need to wage endless wars in the Middle East? What was George Bush doing on that day, reading to children when he was told that planes flew into the World Trade Center? Were those children being used to garner sympathy? When the public is traumatized, you have to expect that many questions will arise. Conspiratorial thinking, which was kind of toyed with and laughed at in the early days of Alex Jones and Bill Cooper, like, oh, maybe UFOs are real, but there's not enough evidence, it's kind of just a joke. Now, these theories have made its way into the mainstream. You have government whistleblowers on the record talking about the existence of UFOs. It's safe to say that nothing is really off the table for discussion because more evidence has come to light. And it's not really something that you can just brush off anymore. So for starters, why is it that some people go against the narrative and why are there others that don't? I have been a conspiracy theorist for a good part of my life. I love to question what were presumed as fact by my friends and family, and have always been very critical of the institutions and the establishment figures. It has become abundantly clear that we are all victims of a propaganda war, and what has been labeled as conspiracy have been at times proven unequivocally true. But there are many theories out there that are frankly bad and have also been proven unequivocally untrue. What makes a person latch onto one theory but not another? How often does one determine fact from fiction based on logic versus a psychological response? Do people ever make decisions based on logic at all? Or are decisions based on emotions, intuition, and cultural pressures with logic as an excuse to justify said decision? When COVID first emerged onto the scene, we all listened to the official narrative about COVID on the news. Any questioning of the narrative resulted in one being called anti-science by Fauci, who deemed himself to be science.
I represent science.
Which is hilarious because if you can't question science, then it is no longer science. Science became a religion and Fauci was the Pope. Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl once wrote, "An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior." COVID was a time that we craved open dialogue, but doing so had people label us as crazy. All that censorship does is make the public thirst for the forbidden fruit, thirst to talk about what is deemed taboo. Behind every tragic event in human history, war, poverty, oppression, just to name a few, lies a deep desire to understand why. And these events are amassed for generations. Generation upon generation of epigenetic trauma marks us in ways that we can't possibly comprehend. Yet we continue to grasp towards these unknown aspects of ourselves so as to feel less vulnerable in this vast and incomprehensible world. Civilizations have always been made of kings and peasants. Though those terms are defunct, it's been pretty obvious after COVID, no? Either voluntarily or not, the overwhelming majority walked in lockstep through it. Now, just to slightly deviate from the COVID topic, if you look at the mainstream dialectic, you have Illuminati conspiracy, which is discussed mostly by conservatives, and critical race theory, which is mostly discussed by the left. Those two narratives are driving the country, which are both rooted in truth. You can tell that there's truth in both for the mere reason that they went mainstream. If consciousness is the ground of reality, how do we get both sides to feel validated so as to reconcile? One thing that's clear is that both sides do not trust authority figures. So what does it mean to be anti-authority? Even if you're not conspiratorial, being at least anti-authoritarian to some extent allows us to look at authority figures with a healthy dose of skepticism. As the education system trains us to be obedient and the mainstream media promoting the utmost respect for authority figures, many are led to view anti-authoritarians as a danger to a safe society.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
But in reality, anti-authoritarians are protecting a thriving society from oppressive rulers who depend on the obedience of the masses. This is in fact what leads to the deterioration of a society. Author C.P. Snow once said, "When you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you will find more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than have ever been committed in the name of rebellion." What we're told creates stability can potentially lead to the dumbing down of society. So there is a need to have alternate voices that can give us some perspective. That is not to say that authority doesn't play an important role in society, it certainly does, but ultimately the truth in of itself is what matters, regardless of who or where it comes from. As I was putting my thoughts together for this video, I had a conversation with my friend Cheese, who I met during the lockdowns.
When it comes to your immune system, what's more important, what you put in your mouth or what you put over it?
He was one of, if not the most powerful speakers and thinkers to come out of our movement against the mandates. Here's an excerpt from a phone call about trauma and the authority figures in our lives.
Now, you take a regular person that had decent enough parents and they trust authority figures, they haven't been exposed to that level of malevolence or given enough just cause to distrust authority. That's where they'll start to project the oppression in different directions. They'll start to see it in what's happened to minorities. That's the negative authority that's like more in their face that they can perceive. Guilt is actually the root of all pathology. Trauma is the manifest version of guilt. Guilt is trauma waiting to happen. If the collective psyche doesn't resolve its guilt, the way that's going to manifest is digital concentration camps.
So what happens when we find out that the authority figures we put our trust into are having sex with children on an island? The way that powerful elites are implicated in sex trafficking and pedophilia, the way that Jeffrey Epstein and his associates are, is quite terrifying when you think about it.
Any comments on the alleged allegation of your connection with Jeffrey Epstein?
Bill Clinton, a proven sexual deviant,
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Flying to Epstein Island 26 times is more proof of an elite sex trafficking ring involving minors because there are clearly more red flags.
Hey Hillary, why'd your husband visit Epstein Island 26 times?
I suffered something very traumatic in my personal life. I was sexually abused as a child. So I had already been hardened to know the behavior of psychopathic predators.
You went through pedophilia. So that connects you to the type of collective matrix that's being oppressed by that. When your primal authority figures aren't trustworthy and you get older, you can just see, oh, this is bullshit.
When it comes to the deception and abuse within society at large, I can see that from a mile away. I'm not just going to turn a blind eye to it. That being said, here's when conspiratorial thinking begins to fall apart. Just because certain information is being suppressed by the mainstream media and the authority figures doesn't necessarily mean it's all true. For example, the recent collapse of the bridge in Baltimore. Thousands of users on X immediately declared this as some sort of terrorist attack. Now, is it possible that it was? Sure, but as of now, I haven't seen enough information that this accidental tragedy was preemptively planned as part of some grand conspiracy. There is a serious problem with many people jumping to conclusions without evidence, and that is largely due to social media, which incentivizes engagement rather than accuracy. Dan Bongino provides a solid explanation for this.
There's a bunch of stuff from every angle of the political sphere where everybody's jumping to a conclusion when the solution to this problem is right in front of you. Would you try to solve a math equation with 7 different variables missing? This is what happens in this media environment because there's money and engagement. Everybody wants to come out with a theory. It was a terror attack. It definitely wasn't a terror attack. That's a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory. Why can't you just wait?
So the question is, why do we jump to conclusions? The way that we normally handle traumatic events is at what we refer to as the post-intellectual level, meaning a perspective beyond traditional frameworks or paradigms. Instead of relying on intellect or academic knowledge, a post-intellectual approach uses intuition, creativity, lived experience, or interdisciplinary thinking. And there is plenty of value in this because the answers to the world's problems cannot only be solved through intellect. But when conspiratorial thinking starts to break down is when it is addressed post-intellectually. When there is a lack of specific facts and evidence, it also demonstrates a lack of systems thinking, that traditional framework of understanding the world which we use every day. Systems thinking does indeed lack the nuances of conspiratorial thinking and vice versa. The key is having a balance of both. Conspiracy theories also tend to be overlapped and molded together into a homogeny that can get very confusing. The term Illuminati, which is really just an umbrella term for the powerful elites running the world, everyone has their own interpretation of who these elites are. Some will say it's the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. Others will say it's the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Jews, or the Bilderbergs, or the World Economic Forum. Just an endless number of groups and controlling interests. So you can't just lump them all together and say the Illuminati is a satanic network of pedophiles who drink baby blood. Even though there may be some that do, there are plenty of people in the World Economic Forum, for instance, who aren't drinking baby blood. And all of these chaotic and traumatic events cannot be explained definitively as a conspiracy. There are incredible amounts of trauma that are being handled post-intellectually. The mistake that's made is when conspiracy theories are presented intellectually. And oftentimes it can sound very far-fetched and these people end up sounding like whacked out nut jobs. And don't get me wrong, they are often correct. They have a solid intuition that there is some cohesion going on in the conspiratorial world. But then the actual grounded outlay of it all can get overlooked when you take systems thinking out of the equation. We are currently functioning on the belief that we make decisions based on logic. We're not. We make decisions out of emotion, intuition, and cultural pressures that use logic to justify it. So before instincts convince you to check your sources off Instagram and TikTok, let's go back to our conversation with Cheese to look at the collective narratives and figure out what needs to be processed.
The thing that's really fascinating to me is that these extreme perspectives of conspiratorial thinking and critical race theory are mainstream now. That's because they've been in the collective psyche for so long, and they've had validity for so long that they make up the stuff that we're all sharing in the collective. When I'm checking myself, it's like, look at the opposite. It's weird. It's like you have conspiracy theory and then critical race theory. And those are the two narratives that are driving the country now. And they both have roots in truth. The question that has to be asked is which one's a bigger threat?
Critical race theory is pushed heavily by the education system, and anybody that challenges those theories is shamed and attacked as a racist or a white supremacist. Now, are there real problems of racism in the world? Absolutely. There are grains of truth in the CRT approach. But this idea that white people and the patriarchy are to be blamed for all of the oppression throughout world history is a bit of a stretch, no? Joe Biden and the liberal mainstream media have declared that white supremacy is the greatest threat facing the country today. You could say that that is a conspiracy theory on the left-wing end of the spectrum. It is often disseminated, ironically, by a lot of white people themselves, the ones marching in the Black Lives Matter protests who haven't seemed to resolve their white guilt. As Cheese said, unresolved trauma as well as guilt are both major causes for distrusting authority figures.
Now the thing is that people that found the conspiracies earlier say like they're normally traumatized. There's normally some level of trauma that's happened psychologically that I argue lets them see it because they're willing to confront it. But then what happens is it turns into a type of hysteria in itself. People that fall into that type of unnuanced critical race theory, they're struggling from guilt, right? So basically, there's a collective psyche with a shadow dialectic between guilt and trauma that's trying to reconcile itself as these things unfold.
So what is the shadow dialectic between guilt and trauma? And what do we mean by the shadow? In Jungian psychology, the shadow refers to the unconscious aspects of someone. These are qualities that are hidden, denied, and repressed. So just like a light is cast onto a wall, there too is a shadow cast by the same light. The light is the conscious mind, and the shadow are the desires, emotions, and impulses that are too dark to discuss, too monstrous to admit that it's in us. But it's there in each and every one of us, and we know it.
When you're abused as a child and you get to a point when you're an adult and you're like, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, my whole life they were making me feel like I did something wrong. Then when the government and all these other f***ing assholes are telling you you're doing something wrong by breathing, it's very easy. It's like second nature for you, like, F you, I didn't do anything wrong. But if you didn't have that type of trauma growing up, you don't have that distinction to realize, like, it's not my fault. What happens is, if the guilt hasn't been processed by, say, a person with a good life, then they start to look and be like, well, how do I trust the experts to get us out of this? Because they've already naturally given their authority away. It turns into a type of ungrounded horseshit if the trauma is not processed on the side of the conspiracy theorists. And then it's weird because we are more a culture that is hypnotized than we are brainwashed. We're hypnotized by the magnitude of, it's not even the times we're living in. It's like the tree of life itself emanates forces that are beyond mortal comprehension. The act of trying to integrate them is incredibly difficult. Then when you live under psychically developed civilization that doesn't realize what's happening, life itself is hypnotic. It's a trance-like state. And then what happens is the collective abusers, whatever, the Bohemian Groves or the Epsteins or whatever the groups are that are manipulated, but there's multiple power groups. It's nuts. It's not like there's one coherent conspiracy.
The other day, a video surfaced of a man setting himself on fire outside of a courthouse during a Trump trial. And it was later reported that this man was an anti-fascist researcher who posted all sorts of conspiracy-laden manifestos against the ruling elite and cryptocurrency. It's not clear what side of the political aisle he was on, but it's a sign that he was at the end of his rope. But as I said in my previous video about this topic, it doesn't matter what his beliefs were, whether he was right or wrong, but that he was drawing attention to issues that people on both sides can possibly agree with. His extreme actions of self-immolation should wake you up to the fact that the left and the right are mere reflections of one another. If you look at, say, the QAnon movement, which is filled with all these unhinged Trump supporters, promoting all sorts of esoteric symbolism and gematria, these bizarre notions that JFK Jr. is still alive and that Trump is still president, are just absolute nonsense.
Donald Trump is president right now.
He's currently the president.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things
things that this Biden person does not have, like the presidential seal and things like that are pretty obvious.
Biden doesn't have the presidential seal?
No.
When he speaks, there's a presidential seal in front of him.
It's not real.
This is where the whole left-right binary falls apart because there are problems on both sides. QAnon and white supremacy are just two examples.
There's a high degree of intelligence that comes from conspiracy theories because you're questioning everything. Like Hegel talks about this. Until you can question your own existence, you're not worthy to do philosophical speculation. Like until you actually wonder the question, am I real? You're not worthy to actually try to think. I never bought into flat earth, but I would never get aggravated when people were talking about it because it's like, no, like what's going on is like they're questioning if the entire matrix around them is actually there. Like it's actually a profound experience, right? And I was really careful to not believe it. There's a lot of reasons because accepting something like that is fucking traumatizing. Your whole worldview is rooted in like one direction, and then all of a sudden like there's this geometric flip. So I was like, I have a lot of reasons to not believe this, like emotionally.
Even before I was sexually abused, I mean, I definitely had, you know, an interest in conspiracy theories. Like, what do you think my trauma was before all of that gave me?
It could have been your mother and father fighting and you were too young to remember it. Those traumas are particularly bad. My father told me about this, about when I was 1 year old in the back of the car, and he was like, you're sitting there sucking your thumb, and I'm having a nervous breakdown because the doctor wouldn't give me my Xanax. Meanwhile, like, I'm absorbing everything. I think about my father losing his mind in front of me multiple times before I was old enough to even remember it. So that's the real shit. Like the trauma that you're too young to remember. It's like, whew.
Cheese is a chess master. He has a degree in philosophy. He specializes in the Hegelian dialectic. He sat with a Zen master, a shaman, and he has over a decade of study in the ways of Kabbalah. He even got kicked out of the Marshall Chess Club for protesting the mandates. He sacrificed his cushy day job to play chess amongst crack dealers and dope fiends in Washington Square Park, all because he wanted to do the right thing. All because he refused to take the shot. So what's the solution? Ultimately, what we're all trying to find out is what is the root cause of our oppression. We all sense that there's some sort of oppressive hand right now. On the conspiratorial 30,000-foot view, you could say, yes, there's an Illuminati force of some kind running the show and such pulling the strings. But on just the basic 10,000-foot view, what we're looking at is just how human nature operates. As the saying goes, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was the conspiracy there first, or was human nature there first? Then you start to see it doesn't really matter what side you're on. We both see that systemic greed is the problem. We both see that the systemic desire for control and domination is the problem.
The major issue that we have now, though, with the rebellion, I swear to God, it's the food supply. And it's the vaccines and the food supply. It's basically farming the food supply. It's a chemically anesthetized civilization. That's what's like really scary, because a natural rebellion would happen, but people are exhausted and sick. Brett Weinstein, or Eric Weinstein, one of them, he said the same thing I said. He's like, we've seen such a gross mismanagement of civilization that mere incompetence no longer suffices to describe what's happening.
You can stay up for hours on end into the night, endlessly researching, going down rabbit holes, complaining on social media, blaming this person and that person. But eventually, what value is it adding to your life? What do you intend to do about it? Because merely exposing it is not enough. Where do you get the power and the strategy to defeat what you see? We get it from integrating our trauma, by doing the shadow work, as Carl Jung calls it. To the conspiracy theorists, I ask ask you to stop projecting all of your problems onto the shadow government and start getting in touch with your own shadow. Same goes for the extreme leftists that are blaming everything on racism and the patriarchy. There is a trauma there that you don't want to face. And the more we continue this, the more that we delay the internal work, the more that we're going to be stuck in the same place that we are now. Because the collective mindset demands it. We naturally resist change. We are too comfortable with the distractions and the division. That is how the collective mindset makes manifest the leaders that we detest. We must unite even with those who feel threatened by our beliefs. How do we deal with the anti-conspiracists?
The other part that I'm curious about is what's the psychology of people who are angry at conspiracy theorists? Like, they want to label them as crazy. Like, I'm seeing stuff where, oh, these are dangerous conspiracy theories.
Because it's a violation of safety. Because the authority structures are what they're clinging to feel safe in tumultuous times. You're literally putting their safety on the line. Imagine if you're like, someone's coming in your house with a knife. You would want someone to tell you. But imagine if there's nobody with a fucking knife, and now you're building your entire life around this idea that somebody has a knife. So if this is the issue, because if we're wrong, it's a big problem. We're not, though, so it's not a problem. You're challenging their sense of safety, which is, I mean, and listen, like that's a visceral experience. These things aren't intellectual debates. When you tell somebody that there's baby drinking pedophiles that want them to take vaccines for some reason, that's an attack on their central nervous system.
And people don't want to feel like they've been duped by the people that they put their trust into.
And rightly so, because if you're getting duped by people that you put your trust into, then you're not safe.
Imagine that you are a successful doctor or teacher, maybe a famous Hollywood celebrity or a pundit for a major media organization. Your success and well-being is governed by dealing with these approved institutions. So naturally, you're not going to question or rebel against the system that enabled your success and your safety net. You are unequivocally going to trust it.
Now, what's starting to happen is that more just highly intelligent people that weren't necessarily traumatized are seeing the conspiracy theories come to pass. Right? Like, Jordan Peterson does this all the time. He won't say it. Like, he won't say, like, there's an Illuminati, but he'll sit there and be like, but there's something weird going on right now. Brett Weinstein and, like, even Naomi Wolf. It's like these people that were never real conspiratorial thinkers, we're starting to see the fruits of that tree start to come to pass. In the 60s, it was the hippies that were not obedient. It was this kind of like boundless love that was there. And now we're collapsing that because there's actually two frameworks.
Because we lived in a more conservative world at one point. You know?
That's a really good point. I mean, what I see is like the fluctuations of time, because the thing was, it was free love, right? So, because there's two dimensions. There's unity, which is when all the pluralities are unified, and then there's oneness, where there's nothing else but the Godhead. And what the conservative type of ideology is, leans more towards the oneness, and the left one leans more towards the unities. Now, what was happening is the left was really conditioned in this country psychically from the 60s to be more anti-establishment until about 2016.
They actually ended up taking over the institutions. Like, their movement was pretty successful because they figured out how to change the system from within. These baby boomers, they became teachers. They started working for Big Pharma.
So that was the rest of my conversation with Cheese. I'm very grateful for someone like him who has a unique perspective on conspiracy theories. And he is someone who has been instrumental in helping me process my own trauma. I will just leave you with these final thoughts. We become stronger not only by integrating our historical traumas, but by reconciling the opposites. Whether you're on the left, the right, the center, or maybe you just don't care about any of it, 95% of the world agrees that we are facing some sort of oppression. How do we find the nuggets of truth on both sides of the equation and come together on what we can agree with? To the powers that be, it is far more threatening to them what unites us rather than what divides us.
What happens is they start projecting all the problems onto the Illuminati instead of actually just doing the personal work on their own trauma. Because if people master themselves, the Illuminati has no power.
So there you have it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Inverted World, and I will see you all next time.
We want to thank today's sponsor, Dr. Stella Emanuel. If you remember her from 2020 amid the pandemic, she went viral when she went on with America's frontline doctors, accurately purporting that social distancing and masking was nonsense, and shared her firsthand experience successfully treating patients with hydroxychloroquine. And what did they do? Smear her, of course. Well, she was right. Using the code FIGHTERS, you'll get 5% off any of her detox kits, COVID care, and more. Go to drstellamd.com for a list of all of her products, and don't forget to use the code FIGHTERS for a discount.